Some leaders command the stage with thunderous speeches and grand gestures. Their power is in their presence, their ability to dominate the spotlight. But there is another kind of power, a quieter, more subtle force that operates from the shadows, a power that guides, that nudges, that shapes events without ever leaving a fingerprint. When you picture Dwight D. Eisenhower, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a single comforting image, the grandfather of a nation. A warm, bald-headed man with an easy grin, a hero of World War II who presided over the peaceful prosperity of the 1950s. The man who gave us the interstate highway system, who loved to play golf, who told us to beware the military-industrial complex. He was Ike, the man America liked, a symbol of calm strength in a turbulent world. But what if that image, as comforting as it is a carefully constructed facade? What if, behind the grandfatherly smile, there was a master of political chess, a hidden hand president who wielded immense power from behind the scenes? Today we are going to peel back the layers of the Eisenhower myth. We will journey back to a dirt-poor childhood in Kansas, shaped by a pacifist mother who belonged to a controversial religious sect. We will uncover the story of a devastating personal tragedy so profound he rarely spoke of it, a loss that nearly shattered his marriage, and we will venture into the secret world of the Cold War, exposing the clandestine CIA operations he personally approved, operations that toppled foreign governments and whose consequences we are still living with today. This is the story of a man who appeared simple but was deeply complex, a leader who projected peace while secretly waging war. To find the real Dwight D. Eisenhower, we have to look past the man the world saw and find the man who worked so hard to remain hidden. To truly grasp the essence of Dwight D. Eisenhower, we must first immerse ourselves in the crucible of his origins, the American heartland at the tail end of the 19th century. This wasn't the Gilded Age of Vanderbilts and Astors, nor the bustling industrial cities of the East. This was the raw, untamed prairie, a land still whispering with the echoes of cowboys and pioneers, now slowly being tamed by the relentless march of railroads and the stubborn will of German immigrant farmers. This was the America of Main Street, where life was hard, faith was strong, and personal histories often contained more than met the eye. Dwight David Eisenhower was born on October 14, 1890, not in the quiet comfort of a Kansas farm, but in a small rented house in Denison, Texas. He was the third of 7 sons born to David Jacob Eisenhower and Ida Elizabeth Stover. The family's roots ran deep into the soil of America's immigrant story. They were descendants of German Mennonites, a fiercely independent pacifist religious sect that had sought refuge from persecution in Pennsylvania centuries earlier. Their migration to Texas was part of a larger American movement, a search for new land, new opportunities, and a fresh start. But the Texas experiment was short-lived for the Eisenhowers. By 1892, with young Dwight barely 2 years old, the family pulled up stakes once more, journeying north to Abilene, Kansas. And it was Abilene, a once notorious cowboy town at the end of the Chisholm Trail, now settling into a respectable church-going Midwestern community, that Dwight would forever consider his true home. This seemingly simple move laid the first layer of the hidden hand character that would define his life. Abilene offered anonymity and the opportunity to forge an identity free from the transient nature of their early years. Life in Abilene was far from easy. The Eisenhower family was poor, even by the standards of the day. David Jacob, Dwight's father, was a gentle but often unsuccessful man. He worked a series of manual labor jobs at a local creamery, then for the Union Pacific Railroad, struggling constantly to provide for his burgeoning family of 7 boisterous boys. Money was tight, sometimes non-existent. The boys wore hand-me-down clothes, patched and repatched until they were threadbare. Meals were simple, centered around staples like cornmeal, beans, and whatever vegetables they could grow in their backyard garden. There was no room for luxuries, no allowance for idleness. From a very young age, Dwight and his brothers understood the meaning of hard work, of pitching in, of communal survival. This ingrained sense of pragmatism, of making do with what you had, would be a cornerstone of Eisenhower's character, subtly influencing his later military and political strategies. He understood resourcefulness born of necessity, not theory. This humble existence, however, belied a fascinating undercurrent of intellectual curiosity and spiritual ferment within the Eisenhower household, primarily driven by his mother, Ida Elizabeth Stover. Ida was a remarkable woman, intelligent, deeply spiritual, and unusually well-read for her time and station. She possessed a formidable personal library, filled not just with religious texts, but with histories, biographies, and classics. It was here in the evenings, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, that young Dwight, often listening to his mother read aloud, began his lifelong fascination with military history. He devoured tales of Hannibal, Alexander the Great, and George Washington, sketching maps of their campaigns. It's a profound irony that a future 5-star general and supreme Allied commander would find his initial sparks of military inspiration under the tutelage of a devout pacifist mother. This early exposure to the grand narratives of conflict, filtered through a lens of intellectual inquiry rather than martial glory, subtly shaped his strategic mind. He saw war as a problem to be solved, a grand chess match, rather than an arena for personal heroics. But Ida's spiritual journey held a secret that would be meticulously obscured for decades. While David Jacob Eisenhower maintained a more traditional Protestant faith, Ida Elizabeth embarked on a dramatic spiritual shift. In 1896, she joined the International Bible Students Association, a new and often ostracized religious movement that would later become known as Jehovah's Witnesses. This was no casual affiliation. The Eisenhower family home in Abilene was used as a gathering place for the local Bible students group. Imagine this: the childhood home of a future American president, a place of quiet, fervent religious study for a group often viewed with suspicion by mainstream society. This is a stunning little-known fact, almost entirely scrubbed from the official narrative of Eisenhower's life. The family carefully downplayed or omitted this detail in later biographies and public statements. Why? Because in early 20th century America, and especially within the rigid hierarchy of the military, being associated with a non-mainstream pacifist religion would have been a catastrophic impediment to a military career. The future general was seen as a man of mainstream Protestant values, albeit one not overtly pious in his daily life. To reveal his mother's deeply personal yet unconventional faith and the family's association with the group would have invited questions about his own loyalties and beliefs, potentially branding him as un-American or unsuitable for leadership by critics who might equate his mother's pacifism with his own perceived lack of religious fervor compared to other generals. While Dwight himself never joined the group, he would later be baptized as a Presbyterian while president. The influence of this intense nonconformist spiritual environment was undeniable. It fostered in him a deeply practical, almost utilitarian approach to faith. He saw religion as a moral compass, a source of personal ethics, and a framework for understanding one's place in the world, rather than a rigid set of dogmas. This pragmatic relationship with spirituality would resurface later in his life, particularly during his presidency. In 1954, at the height of the Cold War and the Red Scare, Eisenhower notably added the phrase, "under God," to the Pledge of Allegiance. This wasn't a sudden personal spiritual awakening. It was a calculated political move, a symbolic act designed to draw a clear ideological line between the God-fearing American Republic and the godless communist Soviet Union. It was a classic example of his hidden hand approach, using a public act of religious affirmation as a tool of statecraft, while his personal faith remained a complex, deeply private matter. Even the most fundamental aspect of his identity, his name, held a hidden story, a testament to the family's informal pragmatism and the quiet influence of his mother. He was originally christened David Dwight Eisenhower, but in a household of 7 boisterous boys, with a father also named David, confusion was inevitable. So to avoid the daily mix-up, his mother, Ida, simply flipped his first 2 names. He became Dwight David. This small, unceremonious change, first recorded in the family Bible, wouldn't be legally formalized until he was a teenager. It reflected a family culture where practicality trumped protocol, where individual identity was shaped as much by necessity as by official decree. It was an early lesson in adapting to circumstances, in making things work without fuss, a characteristic that would define his entire career. In a house overflowing with boys, nicknames were not just common, they were essential. The German surname Eisenhower was a mouthful, so it naturally got shortened. All the Eisenhower brothers eventually became known to their friends and family as Ike, a simple, friendly abbreviation. To distinguish between Dwight and his older, larger brother Edgar, Dwight became Little Ike, while Edgar was Big Ike. The nickname Ike stuck with Dwight for life. It was a humble, folksy, utterly unpretentious moniker that would later prove to be a political goldmine. As a general and then as a presidential candidate, Ike conveyed an immediate sense of approachability, honesty, and Midwestern charm. It helped him connect with the average American voter in a way that the more formal Dwight David Eisenhower never could. It was a brilliant, accidental piece of branding, a touch of common man appeal that cleverly disguised the brilliant strategist beneath. Life in Abilene instilled in Dwight a profound work ethic and a deep-seated humility. He was known for his sunny disposition, his easy smile, and his ability to get along with almost anyone. These traits, often mistaken for a lack of intellectual depth by his adversaries, were in fact core components of his hidden hand leadership style. His affability disarmed people, his modesty made them underestimate him. But beneath the genial surface there was always a spark of rebellion, a restless energy that chafed against strict rules. This wasn't a destructive rebellion, but rather a playful defiance, a tendency towards mischief that hinted at a strong, independent will. His father, David Jacob, a reserved man, instilled in him the value of hard work and self-reliance. But it was his mother, Ida, who truly shaped his intellect and his internal world. Despite her pacifist leanings, she actively encouraged his voracious reading of military history. This seemingly contradictory influence, a desire for peace alongside a fascination with the mechanics of war, would create a lifelong tension within Eisenhower. He would later become a general who profoundly understood the horrors of combat, and a president who carefully avoided committing American troops to large-scale conflicts, a legacy directly traceable to these early formative influences. His family's poverty and his strong, independent brothers also played a significant role. All 7 Eisenhower boys were highly competitive and successful, each forging his own impressive career, though Dwight's would eventually eclipse them all. His brother Milton, Eisenhower, for example, became a respected university president and a trusted advisor to several presidents, including Dwight himself. Yet, the successes of his siblings were rarely highlighted in the official narrative surrounding Dwight. This was a deliberate choice. The focus was always on Dwight as the self-made man, the boy from Abilene who achieved greatness, without the complicating narrative of a family of high achievers. This helped maintain his image as a singular, accessible hero, further solidifying the IKE brand. Dwight Eisenhower graduated from Abilene High School in 1909. For 2 years after, he worked tirelessly at the Bell Springs Creamery, often taking the night shift, earning money to help support his family and contribute to his older brother Edgar's college tuition. This period of manual labor, of long hours and demanding physical work, further cemented his practical, no-nonsense approach to life. It also reinforced his desire for a path that offered more intellectual challenge and a chance to escape the cycle of poverty. His opportunity came, somewhat unexpectedly, through an appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. However, he was just over the age limit for Annapolis. Undeterred, he applied for an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was a competitive process, but young Dwight, with his sharp mind and strong physical presence, secured a scholarship. In 1911, the boy from the Kansas prairie, with little formal exposure to the outside world, stepped onto the hallowed grounds of West Point. West Point, for all its prestige and tradition, was not an easy fit for the fun-loving Kansan. Academically, he was a solid middle-of-the-pack student, graduating 61st in a class of 164. His grades were adequate, but he was far from a star student. He later admitted that he never cracked a book if he could avoid it, preferring to apply himself only when absolutely necessary. His real passions were elsewhere. He excelled at sports, particularly football, where he was a promising linebacker and running back. He was known for his fierce competitiveness on the field, a trait that would later serve him well in the strategic battles of war. But a severe knee injury in 1912 prematurely ended his athletic career, a devastating blow that he feared would also end his military ambitions. It was a forced lesson in resilience, in finding new avenues for success when old ones closed. Beyond the classroom and the athletic fields, Eisenhower was, by West Point standards, a bit of a rebel. He was constantly in trouble for minor infractions and pranks. The strict, almost monastic discipline of the academy often chafed against his easygoing nature. He amassed a steady stream of demerits for things like playing poker, smoking cigarettes, a lifelong habit, and engaging in unauthorized horseplay with his fellow cadets. It's often repeated in popular biographies that he organized a prank so bold it nearly got him expelled, but no official documentation from the academy supports this specific legend. What is clear is that he was a natural leader, capable of inspiring camaraderie and loyalty, but he was not a natural-born follower of rigid, unquestioning authority. His experiences at West Point were a microcosm of his future leadership style. He learned the value of strategic thinking, the importance of discipline, and the complexities of managing egos. He also learned the art of delegation, often allowing others to take the lead on tasks he found less engaging, a precursor to his hidden hand approach. He forged lifelong friendships, understanding that personal relationships and loyalty were just as important as formal hierarchy in achieving objectives. He saw firsthand how men, even highly disciplined cadets, responded better to encouragement and a sense of shared purpose than to harsh commands. This informal, people-oriented leadership style, honed in the barracks and on the football field, would prove to be one of his greatest assets. He graduated in 1915, part of a distinguished class that would later be known as the class the stars fell on, for the sheer number of generals it produced. Among his classmates were future luminaries like Omar Bradley and James Van Fleet. Eisenhower's graduation marked the end of his formative years, a period defined by poverty, hidden spiritual influences, personal resilience, and a quiet, budding leadership potential. In the spring of 1915, a newly commissioned Second Lieutenant Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped out from the hallowed grounds of West Point. The world was teetering on the brink of chaos, but for an ambitious young officer, the journey to greatness would not be a swift, heroic charge. It would be a long, slow grind through the anonymous and often thankless world of the peacetime Army. This long apprenticeship began at his first posting to Fort Sam Houston, near San Antonio, Texas. It was a world away from the manicured lawns of West Point and the quiet fields of Abilene. It was a dusty, sprawling outpost, humming with the tension of the ongoing Mexican Revolution just across the border. It was here, in this unglamorous setting, that his life took an unexpected and romantic turn. In the autumn of 1915, he was introduced to a vibrant, sophisticated young woman named Mamie Geneva Dowd. Mamie was everything Ike was not. She was the daughter of a wealthy and successful meat-packing magnate from Denver, Colorado, raised in a world of comfort and privilege. The attraction between the gregarious girl from high society and the serious, down-to-earth soldier from Kansas was immediate and powerful. Their courtship was a whirlwind, and they were married less than a year later on July 1st, 1916. For Mamie, this marriage was a leap into the unknown. She was trading a life of predictable luxury for the unpredictable and often difficult life of an Army wife. The next several decades would be a blur of constant moves, over 30 of them in 35 years, to a series of dreary, anonymous houses on military bases. It was a life of social obligation, governed by the strict, unwritten rules of Army hierarchy. It was an immense sacrifice, and the strain of this transient, rootless existence would take a quiet toll on her health and their marriage over the years. In the early years of their marriage, the world was descending into the carnage of the Great War. For Eisenhower, it was a time of immense professional frustration. He was a superb organizer and trainer, and for this reason the Army kept him stateside, in command of the newly formed Tank Corps Training Center at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. While his West Point classmates were earning medals in France, Ike was stuck turning recruits into soldiers. He pleaded for a combat assignment, but the war ended just as his orders to ship out to Europe finally came through. He ended the war a temporary lieutenant colonel who had never heard a shot fired in anger, a fact that he feared would permanently stunt his career. But amidst this professional disappointment came a period of profound personal joy. In 1917, their first son, Dowd Dwight, was born. They quickly nicknamed him Icky, and he became the absolute center of their universe. By all accounts, Ike was a tender, doting, and completely captivated father. For a brief, shining moment, the future seemed full of promise. Then just after Christmas in 1920, tragedy struck. 3-year-old Icky came down with scarlet fever. The house was immediately placed under quarantine. For weeks, Dwight and Mamie kept a desperate, helpless vigil by their son's bedside. On January 2nd, 1921, Icky succumbed to the illness. It was the single most devastating event of Dwight Eisenhower's life. "This was the greatest disappointment and disaster of my life," he wrote years later, "the one I have never been able to forget." The loss unleashed a sorrow he could not contain. He would take long, solitary walks for miles, weeping. The loss also placed an almost unbearable strain on their marriage. The shared sorrow, instead of bringing them closer, often created a wall of silence between them. It was a wound so deep that they could rarely bring themselves to speak of it. For the rest of his life, without fail, Eisenhower would send Mamie a bouquet of flowers on September 24th, Icky's birthday. It was a quiet annual ritual of remembrance for a tragedy that forever shadowed their lives. The 1920s were the wilderness years for the U.S. Army and for Dwight Eisenhower. The military was drastically downsized and promotions were agonizingly slow. He was reverted back to his permanent rank of captain and would spend 16 long years as a major. It was during this period of professional limbo that his career was saved by a crucial mentorship under General Fox Connor in the Panama Canal Zone. Connor, a brilliant intellectual soldier, recognized the keen mind hidden beneath Eisenhower's easygoing exterior. He gave Ike an informal but incredibly rigorous graduate-level education in military science, making him read the great works of military history and theory. More importantly, Connor taught him about the politics of coalition warfare, the art of working with allies. The years in Panama were the intellectual forging of the future Supreme Allied Commander. After his tour with General Connor, Eisenhower's reputation as a brilliant staff officer brought him to the attention of the most famous and most difficult personality in the U.S. Army, General Douglas MacArthur. For the next 9 years, Ike's career would be inextricably linked to MacArthur's, a relationship that was both a priceless education and a constant maddening ordeal. The two men were polar opposites. MacArthur was theatrical and autocratic. Eisenhower was practical and collaborative. From 1935 to 1939, Ike served as MacArthur's chief of staff in Manila, tasked with the near-impossible job of building a modern Filipino army from scratch with almost no budget. The two men clashed frequently. Eisenhower was the only man on MacArthur's staff who was willing to stand up to him, but this long, difficult service was also an invaluable education. It taught him how to operate in a complex political environment, and most of all, it was the ultimate masterclass in managing titanic egos. If you could work for and stand up to Douglas MacArthur, you could handle anyone. It was a skill he would need when dealing with men like Winston Churchill and George S. Patton. Throughout this long apprenticeship, Eisenhower was unknowingly mastering the art of the hidden hand. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the world changed forever. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor thrust a reluctant America into a global war. In Washington, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall needed a planner, a strategist, with a clear mind who could see a path to victory. He summoned an obscure colonel from Texas. His transformation into the 5-star general who would hold the fate of the free world began as he arrived in a Washington, D.C. gripped by controlled chaos. General Marshall, the architect of American victory, was facing the near-impossible task of mobilizing for a 2-ocean war. He tasked Ike with heading the War Plans Division responsible for drafting the basic strategy for the Pacific. In this crucible, Ike's unique talents shone. He had an extraordinary ability to absorb vast amounts of complex information, identify core problems, and present clear, concise solutions. He quickly won the complete trust of the most powerful man in the U.S. Army. In the summer of 1942, Marshall made a decision that shocked the Pentagon. He bypassed dozens of more senior officers to appoint Dwight Eisenhower, a man who had never commanded a single unit in combat, as the commanding general of the European Theater of Operations. Months later, his role expanded. He was named Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Torch was a massive military and political gamble. For Eisenhower, it was a trial by fire. For the first time, he commanded a huge coalition force of Americans and British with different cultures, equipment, and egos. He immediately found himself acting not just as a general, but as a diplomat, politician, and manager of personalities. The egos were immense, from the prickly British General Bernard Montgomery to the flamboyant American General George S. Patton. Eisenhower's role was to harness their talents while reining in their flaws. Using the hidden hand leadership style he had perfected for years. His easy smile and humble demeanor masked a will of iron and a sharp intellect. He was the glue that held the alliance together. The invasion of North Africa in November 1942 was a military success, but it immediately plunged Eisenhower into a political quagmire. He made the deeply controversial decision to cooperate with the French Admiral François Darlan, a high-ranking official in the pro-German Vichy government, to secure a ceasefire. The Darlan deal worked, saving Allied lives, but it caused a political firestorm. It was a brutal lesson in the messy intersection of war and politics. It was amid these immense pressures of command that his private world also grew complicated. He was assigned a British driver and aide from the Mechanized Transport Corps, a charming and intelligent Irish woman named Kay Summersby. She became his constant companion, his confidant, and one of the few people with whom he could be himself. Their relationship grew incredibly close, a deep bond of affection and trust forged in the crucible of war. The true nature of their relationship remains a subject of intense historical debate, but it reveals the immense personal strain he was under, thousands of miles from a home and marriage still shadowed by grief. In late 1943, the Allied leaders made their final decision. The long-awaited invasion of Northwest Europe, Operation Overlord, would take place in the spring of 1944. The command of this monumental operation, the most complex in human history, was given to Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was now the supreme commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, responsible for millions of soldiers, a vast armada of ships and aircraft, and the fate of the free world. The preparations for D-Day were a feat of organization without parallel. In the tense hours before the launch, the entire operation was threatened by a massive storm in the English Channel. The decision to go or to postpone fell to Eisenhower alone. It was an agonizing gamble. After a tense final meeting with his meteorologist, who predicted a brief 36-hour window of acceptable weather, Eisenhower made his decision. With the simple words, "Okay, we'll go," he unleashed the invasion. In his pocket, he carried a handwritten note to be released in case of failure, taking full responsibility. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, was a success. It was brutal, bloody, and nearly failed on Omaha Beach, but the Allies secured a foothold in France. The battle to liberate Europe had begun. The months that followed were a series of constant crises, but Eisenhower remained the calm center of the storm, letting his field generals like Patton and Bradley become the public heroes while he did the less glamorous but more critical work of holding the massive Allied war machine together. Even in victory, he faced profound moral questions. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, President Truman privately informed him of the plan to use the atomic bomb against Japan. As he later recounted, Eisenhower voiced grave misgivings, believing Japan was already defeated and that using that awful thing was unnecessary. It was a private, moral dissent, carefully hidden at the time, that revealed the complex conscience of the man behind the 5 stars. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was over. A continent lay in ruins, but it was free. And at the center of this historic victory stood one man, a quiet Kansan, who had become the most famous and beloved soldier in the world. For a man who had spent 3 decades in relative obscurity, this sudden, immense fame was a strange and uncomfortable burden. All he wanted, he claimed, was to retire to a quiet life. But the world and his country were not finished with him yet. Instead of retirement, he was set on a new course, navigating the treacherous currents of the post-war world. This difficult journey as a reluctant politician began with the euphoric celebrations that greeted him upon his return home in 1945. But there was no rest for the hero. President Truman immediately appointed him Army Chief of Staff. His new mission was to preside over the chaotic demobilization of the largest army in American history. It was a logistical and psychological nightmare, caught between the public's demand for a rapid return to normalcy and the stark new reality of the Cold War. In 1948, Eisenhower finally retired from active duty and accepted the presidency of Columbia University. It was a classic case of a fish out of water. The plain-spoken general found himself adrift in a sea of academic politics, bored by faculty meetings and impatient with what he saw as impractical theory. It was during his time at Columbia that the first serious draft Ike movement began. In 1948, President Truman, facing a difficult re-election, privately discussed the possibility of supporting Ike if he would run for president on the Democratic ticket. While the extent of this offer has sometimes been exaggerated, the sentiment was real, but he flatly refused, stating his firm belief that career soldiers should abstain from seeking high political office. His quiet life in academia was not destined to last. In 1950, the communist invasion of South Korea sent a shock wave of fear through the Western world. President Truman once again called upon him, asking him to return to Europe for one last great mission, to become the first Supreme Allied Commander of the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Ike accepted out of a sense of duty. NATO at that point was little more than a paper alliance. His job was to take that promise and forge it into a real integrated military shield, a credible deterrent to Soviet aggression. It was a role that perfectly combined his unique skills as a diplomat general, and he spent months traveling across Europe, using his immense personal prestige to build the political and military foundation for the security of the Western world. While General Eisenhower was forging the shield of the West, a political firestorm was brewing back home. The Republican Party, out of the White House for 20 long years, was desperate for a winner. A powerful faction of moderate internationalist Republicans launched an unprecedented campaign to draft their reluctant hero. They saw Ike not only as a guaranteed winner, but also as the only man who could defeat the rising conservative and isolationist wing of their own party, led by Senator Robert A. Taft. In his headquarters outside Paris, Eisenhower agonized over the decision. He hated partisan politics, but he was also deeply alarmed by the isolationist rhetoric of Taft and his supporters. He feared that if America retreated from its commitments in Europe, everything he had worked for would be undone. Finally, he concluded that his duty to his country now outweighed his personal desires. He resigned his command of NATO and came home to America. The campaign that followed was a political phenomenon. The "I like Ike" slogan was everywhere. His campaign was a crusade, capitalizing on his image as a beloved, unifying hero who stood above the dirty business of politics. He promised to go to Korea to end the stalemated war and to clean up the mess in Washington. In November 1952, he won the presidency in a landslide, crushing the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks in Abilene, the man who had insisted he would never be a politician, had been elected the 34th President of the United States. He had reached the pinnacle of American power, not through scheming or ambition, but through a profound and inescapable sense of duty. The American people had placed their complete trust in the grandfatherly hero, but he was about to enter the White House at the absolute height of the Cold War, a time of nuclear paranoia, covert operations, and immense social change. In January of 1953, the beloved general took the oath of office, inheriting a world gripped by nuclear paranoia. As the hidden hand president, Eisenhower's first and most pressing task was to deliver on his promise to end the bloody Korean War. This public triumph, however, masked the beginning of a new, secret kind of warfare. Even as the guns fell silent in Korea, Eisenhower was unleashing his hidden hand in Iran. The country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the British-controlled oil industry. Eisenhower, fearing Mossadegh was steering Iran toward communism, gave the green light to a secret CIA operation, codenamed Operation Ajax. In August 1953, through a campaign of bribery and black propaganda, the CIA orchestrated a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the pro-Western Shah of Iran to absolute power. In the short term, it was seen as a stunning victory. In the long term, it destroyed Iran's democracy and sowed a deep hatred of America that would explode in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. With the success of the Iran coup as a blueprint, the administration turned its attention to Guatemala. Its democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, had launched a land reform program that threatened the interests of the powerful American-owned United Fruit Company. Portraying Arbenz as a dangerous communist, Eisenhower authorized another CIA coup in 1954, Operation PB Success. Using a combination of a small proxy army and massive psychological warfare, the CIA toppled Arbenz's government. The coup was hailed as another low-cost success, but it ushered in 4 decades of brutal civil war and repression in Guatemala. The hidden hand had succeeded, but at a terrible human cost. While these secret wars were being waged in the shadows, the public face of the Eisenhower presidency was one of peace and ambitious domestic projects. His most visible and enduring legacy was the creation of the Interstate Highway System. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 launched the largest public works project in American history, crisscrossing the continent with 41,000 miles of new roads, transforming the American economy and culture. His was an era of confidence, of growth, of a booming post-war economy that was creating a new, prosperous middle class. The prosperity of the 1950s was, however, shadowed by the deep paranoia of the Cold War. This paranoia reached a grim conclusion in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, an American couple convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. The case landed on President Eisenhower's desk as he was the only one who could grant them clemency. Convinced of the gravity of the crime, he refused to intervene. The decision was and remains controversial. Subsequent evidence, like the declassified Venona papers, confirmed Julius Rosenberg's role as a spy. However, the evidence against Ethel was far less clear, and her exact level of involvement remains a subject of intense historical debate, with many believing her execution was unjust. In June 1953, they were both executed by electric chair. Throughout his first term, Eisenhower projected an image of robust health. This image, however, was a carefully maintained facade, concealing a series of life-threatening health crises. In September 1955, he suffered a massive heart attack. The White House, under his direction, carefully managed the flow of information to prevent a public panic. For several weeks, the nation was effectively run by a triumvirate of his most trusted aides. He eventually made a full recovery, but in June 1956, he underwent major abdominal surgery for ileitis, a severe inflammation of the small intestine, similar to what is now known as Crohn's disease. And in 1957, he suffered a minor stroke. Each time, the hidden hand worked to conceal the full extent of the president's vulnerability, preserving the public's confidence in their calm and steady leader. In January of 1957, Eisenhower began his second term. While he projected calm, powerful, and disruptive forces were gathering, he was about to be forced to show his hand in ways he never expected, from the schoolhouse steps of Little Rock to the brink of nuclear war. This calm before the storm was shattered on October 4th, 1957, by a faint electronic beep from space. A wave of national hysteria followed, with fears of a dangerous missile gap. In this moment of crisis, the hidden hand was at its most effective. Publicly, Eisenhower projected absolute calm. He downplayed Sputnik's significance, infuriating his critics. But what his critics didn't know was that Eisenhower was holding a secret ace up his sleeve, the U-2 spy plane. For years, he had authorized top-secret reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union. He knew with a certainty that his critics lacked that the missile gap was a fiction, and that the United States held a vast lead in strategic weapons. So, while he calmed the public, he acted decisively in private. Spurred by the Sputnik crisis, his administration moved quickly. On July 29, 1958, he signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, officially creating NASA to organize the American effort to win the space race, and pushed through the National Defense Education Act, a massive federal investment in science and math education. It was a classic Eisenhower performance: public calm, masking private decisive action. While Eisenhower was focused on the global chessboard, a domestic crisis was brewing that would challenge his leadership and his conscience: civil rights. In 1954, the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Eisenhower personally was a man of his time, skeptical of the federal government's ability to force social change. But in September of 1957, the crisis exploded in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 exceptionally brave African-American students attempted to enroll in the all-white Central High School. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, in a brazen act of defiance, mobilized the Arkansas National Guard to physically prevent the students from entering. For Eisenhower, this was the ultimate challenge. It was no longer a debate about social policy. It was a direct assault on the authority of the U.S. Constitution. His hidden hand was forced. On September 24, 1957, he did something no president had done since Reconstruction. He sent federal troops into the South to enforce the civil rights of African Americans. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered in the elite 101st Airborne Division. The sight was stunning. Paratroopers with fixed bayonets escorting the 9 terrified but determined black students into the school. Eisenhower had acted not out of a passionate commitment to racial integration, but out of a rigid, soldierly commitment to his constitutional duty. As his second term drew to a close, Eisenhower was determined to leave behind a legacy of peace. A planned summit in Paris in May of 1960 with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was to be the capstone of his presidency. But that hope was shattered. On May 1, 1960, a top-secret American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The White House, believing the pilot was dead, issued its pre-prepared cover story. It was a weather research plane, but it was a trap. A few days later, a triumphant Khrushchev revealed that they had not only the wreckage of the spy plane, but also the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive and well. It was a profound diplomatic embarrassment. Eisenhower was forced to publicly take personal responsibility for the spy mission. At the Paris summit a few weeks later, a furious Khrushchev delivered a blistering public tirade, demanding an apology. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev stormed out, and the summit collapsed. Eisenhower's dream of ending his presidency on a high note of peace had been destroyed. On January 17, 1961, just 3 days before he left office, Eisenhower delivered his televised farewell address. He stunned the nation with a solemn intellectual warning. In the councils of government, he said, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. It was an extraordinary moment. The most famous general of his generation was warning the nation about the dangers of the very establishment he had helped create. It was a profoundly prophetic speech, the final most public act of the hidden hand. He retired to his farm in Gettysburg, a beloved elder statesman. But how would history judge the full measure of his presidency? The final secrets of the hidden hand president were yet to be uncovered. In January of 1961, the old general walked out of the White House for the last time. The battle for his place in history was just beginning. This final verdict of history would begin to take shape during his retirement, as the old soldier settled into his beloved farm at Gettysburg. But he was also an elder statesman, regularly consulted by his successors. His primary focus, however, was on shaping his own legacy. He undertook the immense task of writing his 2-volume presidential memoirs, The White House Years. These books are a fascinating final act of his hidden hand leadership, presenting his presidency exactly as he wanted it to be seen, as a period of common-sense conservatism and steady leadership. But what the memoirs leave out is almost as important as what they include. He meticulously downplays his own role in complex decisions. He glosses over the secret CIA coup in Iran and Guatemala. He makes almost no mention of the deep personal anguish caused by the death of his first son, Icky, and the name Kay Summersby appears nowhere. The memoirs were his final act of curation, an attempt to present to history the same calm, steady, and uncomplicated image he had so successfully projected. His final years were quiet, and on March 28, 1969, Dwight D. Eisenhower died at the age of 78. The nation mourned the passing of a hero. As the nation moved into the turbulent years of the late 1960s and 1970s, a strange thing happened to Eisenhower's reputation. It began to fade. The first generation of historians to assess his presidency were often harshly critical. In a famous 1962 poll, Eisenhower was ranked a mediocre 22nd among American presidents. To the new generation of liberal, activist historians, he looked like a do-nothing president, a passive, disengaged man who would rather be on the golf course than in the Oval Office. His famous hidden hand style was completely invisible to them. They saw only a man who delegated all his power. His cautious approach to civil rights seemed weak and insufficient. The story of Eisenhower's historical reputation is a powerful lesson in how history is written and then rewritten. The change began in the late 1970s and early 1980s for one simple reason: the archives were opened. For the first time, historians were granted access to his previously classified presidential papers, his private diaries, and the minutes of his National Security Council meetings. And what they found was a revelation. The man they found in the documents was not the passive grandfather of popular myth. He was a president who was deeply, almost obsessively, involved in every detail of his administration. The record showed a leader who was a sharp, analytical, and demanding taskmaster. Political scientist Fred Greenstein, in his groundbreaking 1982 book, was the first to give this style a name, the hidden hand presidency. Revisionist historians use the new evidence to paint a completely new portrait of Eisenhower. They discovered that the CIA coups in Iran and Guatemala were operations that Eisenhower had personally supervised. They learned that his calm response to the Sputnik crisis was a calculated strategy based on top-secret U-2 intelligence. They saw how he had subtly but effectively used his executive power to undermine Senator McCarthy. The image of the do-nothing president was a caricature, an illusion that Eisenhower himself had deliberately and skillfully cultivated. His genius was in achieving his goals quietly, often letting others take the credit for successes and the blame for failures, all while he guided the ship of state with a firm, hidden hand. Thanks to this great re-evaluation, the modern historical consensus on Dwight D. Eisenhower is vastly different. He is now consistently ranked by scholars as one of America's greatest presidents, often placing in the top 10. His successes are clear: 8 years of remarkable peace and prosperity, the interstate highway system, and a prophetic warning about the military-industrial complex. But this new, more positive assessment is not without its deep and troubling shadows. The same declassified documents that revealed his hidden hand genius also laid bare the dark side of his foreign policy. The covert coup in Iran and Guatemala are now widely viewed as disastrous interventions. His administration's slow approach to civil rights is still seen as a failure of moral leadership. His is a complex and often contradictory legacy. He was a fiscal conservative who launched the largest public works project in American history. He was a man of peace who used a secret agency to wage clandestine wars. He was a Republican who sent federal troops to enforce the civil rights of black students in the Democratic South. He was a 5-star general who warned the nation about the dangers of excessive military influence. So who was the real Dwight D. Eisenhower? In the end, he was a man forged by a lifetime of contradictions. He was the son of a pacifist mother who became the world's most famous soldier. He was a boy from the impoverished side of the tracks who became a symbol of middle-class prosperity. He was a man who suffered a profound, unspeakable personal tragedy, yet projected an image of cheerful, grandfatherly optimism. He was a reluctant politician who became a masterful one. Perhaps the greatest secret of his life is the one that was hiding in plain sight all along. The image of the simple, honest, straightforward Ike was his most brilliant and enduring creation. He understood the power of public perception. He knew that in a dangerous and anxious age, what the American people needed most from their president was a sense of calm, steady, and unwavering strength. He deliberately created and projected that image, while his hidden hand did the complex, often dirty, and morally ambiguous work of governing in the shadows. His story is a powerful testament to a unique and now perhaps extinct form of American leadership. It is a reminder that the loudest voice in the room is not always the most powerful, and that true strength often lies in restraint. But it is also a cautionary tale. It shows us how a leadership style dedicated to secrecy and the avoidance of public accountability can lead a nation down dark paths, the consequences of which may not be understood for generations. He was the calm at the center of the storm, a quiet, steady hand that shaped an era, a man far more complex, more cunning, and ultimately more consequential than he ever allowed the world to see.